Good morning, everybody. This is the SBS webinar, the Thomas Theorem panel, and we'll start in a few more moments when it gets 10 o'clock. I'll introduce everybody and we'll get started. Right now, if you haven't figured it out yet, you can't speak and us hear you, nor can we see you on our camera. If you'd like to communicate with us, you can use the chat feature to post comments or ask questions of the panelists once we get to that point in the panel discussion. And we'll start the event in just a few more moments.
Hey guys,
Hello.
I'm not planning on participating, but for some reason Lloyd signed me up as a panelist and I just wanted to attend. So
Yeah.
I don't know how to black myself out. What I might do is just watch it later so that I'm not
Okay.
on the view
No,
screen.
you can black yourself out and I'll mute you.
Okay,
We just decided to put all the sociologists in as panelists in all the sociology panels at the last minute yesterday. Okay.
oh, okay,
But
okay.
I'll mute you and you can just black yourself out. Okay.
Okay, I just didn't want to confuse the issue for you guys, so.
Just say it. Confuse me. Just come out and say it. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, this is the Thomas Theorem panel discussion. You're not going to be able to speak or turn your camera on during the webinar if you're an attendant. If you want to communicate with us, ask any questions or make any comments, please use the chat feature. You can get to the chat feature by pulling your mouse arrow down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a toolbar pop up. There'll be a dialog box there with chat, C-H-A-T written under it. Just click on that and a panel will pop up usually to the right of your screen and you can see where you can type in your question or your comment there. So let's get started. First, let's define what the Thomas Theorem actually is. Unless you're a sociologist or some other social scientist, you've probably never heard of this, but it's a major principle in sociology. Don't let the term theorem mislead you. This is a traditional sociological theory. It's not mathematical. Usually we hear the term theorem applied specifically to a quantitative theory, not so much here. The Thomas Theorem is a sociological theory which was formulated in 1928 by William Isaac Thomas and his wife, Dorothy Swain Thomas. Both were sociologists. And they said if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And since this was written in 1928, we can forgive them of their sexism. That's been generalized to people, which is how they actually applied it. In other words, the shared interpretation of a situation causes the social action. Now, what does that mean in English? If a person has a shared understanding with other people, then they think similarly in similar circumstances, environments when that understanding is applicable. And that's going to generate a pattern of behavior. It's going to generate a shared response. And that's what sociologists are interested in. In sociology, our scale is the largest in the social sciences. Doesn't mean it's better. It just means we look at larger phenomena and larger variables. So applying the sociological imagination, the sociological perspective, we're trying to explain the behavior of millions of people, sometimes over hundreds of years. So what the Thomases brought up was that pattern of behavior is going to have a real impact, whether the shared understanding that's generating it or not is legitimate, whether it's real, whether it's accurate. So, how to illustrate this? Let's take a totally fictitious example, vampires. Let's assume that people in Columbia, South Carolina suddenly determine that vampires are real. That shared understanding is going to produce shared patterns of behavior in that population. People aren't going to want to go out at night because they don't want to become the victims of vampires. And that can cause all kinds of issues socially, politically, economically. For example, in 5 Points, people go down there to watch movies, eat food, go grocery shopping, to hang out with their friends, listen to music, drink coffee. All of this generates money for the 5 Points area, specifically in Columbia in general. If people are afraid of being attacked by vampires, they're not going to go into the 5 Points area at night on weekends when that place generates a large amount of its money, and that's going to produce a micro recession. Vampires aren't real. The micro recession that's created by that shared belief in vampires is real, and its impact is real. So you're going to see businesses shut down. You're going to see people become unemployed. It's going to result in social isolation, and purchasing patterns are going to shift, and the economy is going to change, and how people relate to each other is going to change depending upon how long this behavior persists. So so that's the fictitious example that I've set up, so we can generalize this and start applying it to police. How can shared misunderstandings of police behavior, the character of police as a group, or the purpose of police as a social institution by the general public result in independent and real problems? Dwayne, why don't you give us an example?
Okay, so before we get into the policing discussion, let me sort of give you a real world example of the Thomas theorem. And I often think of the Thomas theorem in more simplistic terms. Essentially, if we wanted to simplify it, the Thomas theorem says perception becomes reality. Whatever your perception is, that molds your reality as you understand it, and then you act accordingly. So let's talk about the sort of the curious case of Tanya Head, or Alicia Head, who went by Tanya. Tanya was born in Barcelona, Spain, and to a fairly wealthy family. She graduated from one of the more prestigious colleges in Spain in economics, and by all accounts was a very good student. She got a job with Merrill Lynch. She came to the United States, to New York, and got a job working in the World Trade Center. She was engaged to a gentleman named Dave, who also worked in the World Trade Center. He worked in the other tower opposite to where her office was. And unfortunately, they were both in the towers on 9/11. Dave did not get out. Tanya did. And as you can imagine, that had a pretty profound impact on her life. She started an online network support group for fellow survivors. There was already a 9/11 survivors network in place. She made contact with them, and they merged their two groups. And ultimately, she was such a involved participant and such a champion for 9/11 survivors. She ultimately became the president of that organization. And in 2005, when they opened up the World Trade Center Visitor Center, World Trade Towers Visitor Center, she was chosen, understandably so, to essentially represent the network. And she was honored by Mayor Bloomberg. She was honored there by former Mayor Giuliani and by Governor Pataki for the work that she had done for 9/11 survivors. There's just one problem. Tanya Head wasn't even in the United States when the 9/11 attack happened. She was sitting in class in Barcelona, Spain. And every single one of you, until I just told you that, thought Tanya Head was a 9/11 survivor. That was reality to you. As far as you knew, she was a 9/11 survivor, as did everyone else in that network. She had a scar on her arm that she had sustained from a car accident when she was a kid. And it was a very grievous wound. She had almost lost her arm. And of course, when she told the story of her survival, she almost lost her arm in the attack. And of course, the scars were there. She was very adept at giving a realistic account of the experience. And that's because she had read the accounts of other people and then forged her own story using elements from all these different stories, so that anybody that listened to her that was actually there said, yeah, that's pretty much how it happened and how it went down. And so my point in telling you the story is to show you just how powerful this is. Think about what I just told you. This woman became the president of an organization for survivors of an attack that she wasn't anywhere near. She was 3,000 miles away in Spain. But because they perceived her story as true, because they perceived her as a fellow survivor, and because that became her reality, for all intents and purposes, she was a 9/11 survivor. And that's exactly how the Thomas theorem works. Their shared definition and understanding resulted in their social action, which was welcoming her and making her president of this organization. So,
And as I understand, she was a very effective president until that
yes,
moment, correct?
she was an excellent president. She was very good at that, in that role, which again just shows you just how kind of powerful that is.
And it's the flip side of that theory. These things are like cars. These social theories, the hypotheses, the theorems, they're going to go where you point them. There's nothing innately good or bad about them. It's a theory. It's an understanding, a model. And you know, I think I forgot, being such a terrible host that I am, to introduce our other panelists. The person I've been talking with is Professor Dwayne Lee. He's the director of the Criminal Justice Program. And Professor Bill McSorley, who's the former director of our paralegal program, who we've still captured and is teaching adjunct on the campus for us now.
Hi, everyone.
All right. So let's go to a direct police example. And explore this difference between the public expectation and understanding of police and what is proper behavior, and police responsibility based upon what the courts and what the laws and what the departmental procedures say. And let's look at this gap between this understanding. One example would be the coordinated fire myth, the idea that when police officers arrive at a scene, and they're confronted with an immediate threat, and they determine that they should use deadly force, that it's unreasonable for them to shoot a suspect who's an immediate bodily threat 12 times,
right,
8 times. But when that decision is made, often the public, not often, many times the public don't understand the actual circumstances that law enforcement work in. When I was in law enforcement and I responded to a scene like that with 2 or 3 other police officers, often from different departments that I've never met before, I'm not going to have a conversation with them if the guy starts pulling a rifle out of the trunk of his car. I'm not going to look at him at another officer and go, hey, Billy Joe Bob, it's Tuesday. According to the calendar, it's your day to shoot him. Instead, I'm going to apply my training. I'm going to be focusing in on that person, and I'm going to be looking for indications that they're going to become an immediate bodily threat to me, the other officers, and even more important, the civilians around me. And when he starts sending me those signals, I'm going to start responding appropriately, and I'm going to accelerate the situation to control it. I'm not in a fight in high school. I am not going to match the level of force he's using, because that will not ensure that I can control the situation and eliminate the threat to other people. At the same, and that's what I've been trained to do, and that's what the courts expected me to do. At the same time, if these officers have been, quote, properly trained, unquote, they're going to be going through the same process. We are not going to be looking at each other. We're going to be looking at the threat and the environment immediately around the threat. Okay. And when that shotgun or rifle barrel starts going up and we've identified ourselves as officers loudly and told him to drop the gun, we're all going to respond, often independently of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1 second, when I decide to shoot him, if we've been trained properly, the other officers are going to come to that same conclusion. And 2 or 3 officers feasibly, reasonably, under those conditions, might shoot him at the same time.
Correct.
And that's going to result in him getting shot once or twice by each officer at the scene. And those bullets add up quickly. And if you've ever been in a high stress situation, you literally can get tunnel vision. Your hearing becomes directional. So you're not aware of what the other officers who are not a threat to you are doing. You're focusing in on the threat. Professor Lee, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, that's absolutely right. You're not keying off what the other officers are doing. You're keying off what the suspect's doing. And so what you've got is you've got 3 people independently that are in fear of their life, whose primary concern is protecting themselves and protecting the people around them. And so I'm not keeping track of how many times the person next to me is firing and vice versa. And in fact, you become so tunnel focused in that. Most officers after a shooting, when asked how many rounds did you fire, they're unaware. I don't know. Yeah, they just don't, because you keep firing until you no longer perceive that there's a threat. Mm-hmm. And this gets back to a sort of another sort of misperception, which is the idea of the one-shot incapacitation. The best way I've ever heard this explain, and this really gets at the crux of the difference between society, a large part of the public's perception of reality versus actual reality. He said police officers are trained by an academy, the public is trained by Hollywood. And I don't know that I've ever heard a more true statement by that. If you look at the way armed conflict is portrayed on TV and in film, there's a lot of consistencies that you see. In Hollywood, when people are shot, they're almost always instantly incapacitated. They are knocked back several feet. There's a lot of blood. They go down almost instantaneously, and the fight's over. If you actually study shootings and if you study use of force, you find out very quickly that is entirely untrue. There's only 2 things that incapacitate a person from gunfire. You either get a central nervous system shot, which disrupts the entire central nervous system. And if you get that, yeah, you'll get a very quick incapacitation. That almost never happens, especially not from handguns. The other thing that incapacitates people from gunfire is a drop in blood pressure caused by exsanguination, which is a fancy way of saying blood loss. People have to lose enough blood so that their blood pressure drops and they go down. That can take minutes. That can take multiple shots. And you're talking about a person who has adrenaline pumping through their body. They're in an excited state, fight or flight, just like you are. And they often don't even know they've been hit. And you certainly don't know they've been hit. In real life, you don't see when the bullets hit the target. You don't even know. You shoot until they're no longer up and a threat. And they may be taking multiple hits. You don't have any way of knowing that because you can't see that. it is a very common thing to see in police shootings. People get mortally wounded. And for those of you that may not be familiar with that terminology, when you're mortally wounded, that means you've sustained a wound that is going to kill you, that you're not going to survive. And we see people, suspects, over and over and over again retain a mortal wound and continue into the fight like nothing's happened. One of the best examples of this you can see is a dash cam of an Oregon State trooper made a traffic stop, engaged in a gunfight with the suspect at incredibly close range. They were literally essentially across the width of the hood of his patrol car from each other. They exchanged multiple rounds at each other, and then the suspect disengaged from the fight, got in his car, and drove away. They found him in his car about a half a mile down the road, dead, slumped across the steering wheel of his car. He had been shot in the heart. He was mortally wounded, but he disengaged from that fight, got in his car, and drove away. And if you've ever seen that video, you would never in a million years have thought that guy had been hit at all. And that happens more often than not. And so because the public has been essentially trained by Hollywood, the expectation is you shoot somebody, they're immediately incapacitated. And if you keep shooting them more than once or twice, then you're obviously out of control and you're just looking to kill somebody or something like that. And that's just not the case. Those officers are responding to a threat that is very, very real. And anybody placed in that position is going to do what they feel they need to do to defend themselves. And you also hear this, people further this idea, why don't they just shoot to wound or shoot the gun out of their hand? And again, this is Hollywood nonsense. It's completely unrealistic. Police officers have an accuracy rate in the field of 22%. That's it. 22%. That means only 22% of the time when they fire at a suspect do they actually hit the suspect. And that is aiming at the center of body mass, which is the largest target on the human body. If they tried to just aim for a leg or an arm or something like that, their hit percentage would be 0. And it wouldn't matter even if it was 100%, because as I just explained, shooting them in the arm and leg is not going to incapacitate them. They're going to stay in that fight and still be a threat to everybody around them. As I made the point to students many times over the years, that a lot of our students hunt, and anybody who's ever deer hunted can tell you that you can shoot a deer and blow half its heart out of its body and it will run 100 yards. And human beings will do very similar things because of the adrenaline dump, because of the hormones, because of the fight or flight and so forth. And again, that's just not something that's ever portrayed accurately by TV. So that's a real problem with perception.
Also adding to that, agree with everything you said 100%. Also, a lot of the people, you've got to remember the situations in which police are called. Usually the police aren't called until the situation's accelerated to a point where the normal civilians, they are using their own understandings of what they're supposed to do and what not they're supposed to do and how to do it, can't handle the situation. And in a lot of cases, we're seeing this now. This has been a problem for a long time. At least they've been studying it, at least since the 1980s. And that is dealing with people who have mental disease, mental illness, mental problems. And some of them can be on prescription drugs. You can also, police officers also run into people on illegal drugs. And sometimes those are stimulants, and it's gonna prolong the moment of incapacity. So even if you were to shoot somebody 3 or 4 times and you would think a regular person would fall down, you're dealing with someone who's on artificial stimulant and they are going to die. When we were in the military, we called those people walking dead before it became a more popular term. But they're just going to keep running until the chemicals making their heart beat and their brain function aren't getting circulated by the blood to the brain.
Mhm.
And that's not uncommon. I believe in Florida, a guy was on crocodile, which is it crocodile or Alex crocodile, right? The crocodile drug, and he ate part of a guy's face, and the police had to actually end up shooting that man to stop him.
Mhm.
And they shot him several times. Any one of those shots was a mortal wound, but it wasn't enough to stop the guy. So drugs are also an issue with that. Um, Also, the idea of controlled fire with multiple people um, shooting at one suspect. You also have to remember this: the police want to take control of the situation as quickly as they can, but often when it cuts to the point that they have to use deadly force, the police are trying to recover control of the situation, and they're rarely in control of the circumstances, or they wouldn't be drawing their weapons to begin with. Professor Lee, I think you have another example of that.
So there's a pretty famous case in New York, the Diallo case. And what happened in this case was the at that time the New York Police Department had a special sort of task force called the Street Crimes Unit. And they were out one night and they saw Mr. Diallo, who they thought matched the description of a serial rapist that was active in that neighborhood. So they approached him, and he was fearful. He said, these which he would not have known, approached him, and he came from another part of the world where relationships with the police were pretty scary, and so he did an understandable thing. He ran. Well, they gave pursuit. He ran into his apartment building. It was late at night. It was very, very dark. And as they went up the steps up towards him, he had stopped, even though they had asked him to stop many times and produce some ID. At this point, he decided, okay, the best thing for me to do is stop and do that. And he stopped, produced his wallet, turned around, and held his wallet out towards the officers. Well, when they got up to the top of the steps, one officer saw that in the dark, thought that it was a weapon pointed at him. He fired reflexively and then rolled off the footing, rolled sort of down the steps. When the other officers saw that, their perception was that, look at it from their point of view, they heard a shot, then they saw their companion go down. And of course, they made the understandable conclusion, or drew the understandable conclusion, that their partner had just been shot. And so they surged forward and they all began firing. And ultimately, they wound up firing quite a lot of rounds. I think it was 47 rounds or something like that. And Mr. Diallo was hit, I think, 17 times or so forth, and died at the scene. There was a lot of anger over that because Mr. Diallo was unarmed, and it was certainly tragic. But again, they were charged with second-degree murder, but when they went to court, they were all acquitted. And the reason they were acquitted was because once the jury heard the details, and this kind of makes an interesting point. You can hear things that are factual, but until you know all the context behind it, again, the meaning changes. It's back to the Thomas theorem, the perception versus the reality. And when the jury applied what's called objective reasonableness which is a term that the court used in a previous court case called Graham versus O'Connor, which is the standard by which you're supposed to judge police use of force. They put themselves in that position. They said, if I was one of those officers on those stairs and I heard a shot and then saw my partner go down, what would I have thought happened? And the jurors were forced to conclude, that I would have thought that my partner had just been shot and that I was probably next, and I would have probably surged forward and returned fire. And the fact that it was actually his gunshot that they heard and that he had gone down because he had lost his balance, they had no way of knowing that at the time. So that was their reality in the moment. And unfortunately, it had a tragic consequence. But that's objective reasonableness.
And that brings up another good point that could be generalized even further. In the 2019, late 2018 riots, police were responding to rioters. Now, in sociology and in criminal justice studies and in other social sciences that get into this, like anthropology um, and political science, all the studies show at these demonstrations that turn into riots, you've actually got two groups of people. All right. You have the overwhelming majority of people who are protesters, and they are nonviolent.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't engage in violence. They're there for demonstration and communication. Um, th- the rioters are a small, minuscule nest within those protesters, and they're usually not socially associated with them. They don't fall in the same social categories. And they come there with a predisposition, a plan to riot. And what we see in the media is the protesters being shown, not the rioters. And then we see the police responding to a subgroup within that larger gathering, the protesters. And the perception is the police are responding to the protesters. Not only are they physically attacking the protesters, they're symbolically attacking what the protesters are objecting against by interfering with their First Amendment rights. But as Professor Lee mentioned, once we start finding out details about what happened, like LA riots in 2019, and I've watched video of this, and the chief of police in Los Angeles and then later in, I think, Seattle, had actual drone footage of this occurring. When you hear that police are assaulting protesters who are throwing water bottles at them, the first thing that comes into the public's mind is a water bottle. Sure, that's going to sting. That's not going to feel good. But what they're not telling you is often those within the rioters, those water bottles are frozen
Right.
and brought there. So when they throw the water bottle, it's like getting hit with a brick. And they had video evidence of this. Um, the protest signs that the rioters carried were made out of the vinyl tubing, and they had sharpened the edge of that tubing that they had mounted the signs on top of, in effect, had a spear and a spike that they were going to use against the police. And there's drone footage of them removing the signage, and you can see those spikes that they've actually sanded down. Also, there's drone footage of them once those things were taken away, running to, in Los Angeles, a small pickup truck and picking up other signs that had been prepared that way. Finally, I mentioned drone footage. Those riders learned very, very quickly, and they started bringing black umbrellas with them, large umbrellas. And the police learned very quickly when those umbrellas were going up, they were shielding them, pulling out the frozen water bottles, taking off the sign tops to expose the sharp edges, and the situation was getting ready to accelerate. So there's a misconception fundamentally based upon a lack of information that is being supplied by not only the media, but also the police. The police withhold information like this and precipitate this problem and complicate it. Professor McSorley, would you like to give us an example of why the police would want to withhold information that would actually give a more accurate understanding in the public as to why the police responded the way they did?
Sure, and actually I've got a few other things I wanted to address as well, and I'll ask you both to jump in as you would like. My background, I've been an attorney for 30 plus years, so I have a slightly different perspective. One thing about the Diallo case, if some of you are listening to this, you may be sitting there thinking, you know what, at that criminal trial, the only facts they heard were the facts that were stated by the police. And maybe the police concocted the story of whatever. And all they have as jurors is the evidence that came up in that case. So, but if you're skeptical about it, I understand. And we'll be talking more about that bigger issue later. One other thing I want you to know about the Diallo case is that although the defendants, the police officer defendant or defendants in the criminal case were not found guilty, Mr. Diallo's family received a $3 million civil settlement. And one thing I want to touch on is the difference between the standard of proof in a criminal case versus the standard of proof in a civil case. And I know you all know from TV and classes and otherwise, in a criminal case, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, which not to quantify it, because you really shouldn't do that, but I'll say it's somewhere around 98, 99%. You may have some doubt, but it's not reasonable. And in that case, it is very, in any criminal case, it is very difficult to get a conviction. And if you've ever watched TV and said, how could they find them not guilty? That's why it is such a high standard. And that's why the great majority of cases end in plea bargaining, because you want to make sure that you're able to get some sort of conviction against that defendant. So let me compare that with the civil side. In a civil case, the standard of proof is what's called the preponderance of the evidence. And all that really is the tipping of the scales of justice. So all the plaintiff has to prove in that case is that it's ever so slightly more likely than not. And I imagine the police in deciding to settle that case said, you know what, there are some bad facts here. And certainly every police officer to a man would have said, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. You know, we were doing our job and the circumstances were such that this is what happened, but I'm sure they all felt badly. But in a civil case, you know, was there negligence there by the police officer? I think the possibility was very strong that they could have found them to be civilly liable. The classic case, I guess, is the O.J. Simpson case, where he was found not guilty in the murder of his former spouse and her friend, the Goldman fellow. But in the civil cases, both families, I believe, were awarded multi-million-dollar verdicts. One other thought, as we talk about this, you know, your explanation of how these multiple shootings and why these multiple shootings occur is an excellent explanation. And yet communication is key, because I would guess most people listening to this did not know that. And as they're sitting there saying, oh, that's why. And why isn't this kind of communication of police procedure made to the public? Some nice public service announcements, you know, we're police officers, we're good guys, but this is why these bad things happen sometimes. I think it would make the public more understanding. And maybe the balance is, well, we don't want to talk too much about police procedure because we might be giving, you know, tips to the criminals out there of how to do a better job committing the crimes in the future. But those are just some of the basics. And, you know, the underlying core of all this, I think, is we take police officers, and most of them go to work every day and do a great job. And it's only the bad ones we hear about. And it's only the bad priests that we hear about. And it's only the bad lawyers that we hear about. And one more of these, it's only the bad peaceful protesters, you know, as was touched on. And every time I hear about a lawyer who did something bad, I sit there and say, oh man, you're bringing shame on the whole profession. And I'm sure people in law enforcement feel the same way. And I'm sure when there's 1,000 people out there holding up their picket signs, peacefully protesting, and, you know, 6 or 8 people go off the rails and start breaking windows and lighting things on fire, you know, I'm sure everybody at some point in your life has had a sense of what that feels like. And I'll open that up to a response if anybody. I saw a chat come in from somebody.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and address. Let me speak to. I can sort of piggyback on something you said, Bill, and also address a question that came in on the chat. You know, why isn't there better communication with the public by the police? Because that's a great question. I think one of the areas where this is most sort of important is this notion of body cams. And, we saw many years ago a big push for officers more and more to start being equipped with body cameras. And so that people can actually get a sort of a first person account of an incident as it occurs. Well, whenever there's a controversial use of force or just police interaction, one of the questions that gets asked is, well, people are asking to see the body cam, and if the body cam would clarify what happened and would support what the officer's account is, it would seem like you would want to get that out to the public as soon as possible, right? And if you don't release it to the public, it almost creates a perception of the opposite, right? Is in like, well, what are they trying to hide, right? Or does the body cam or does this camera contradict, what actually happened? And there's a lot of reasons for why the police historically don't do that. There's a couple of reasons. First of all, when you release that body cam photo or dash cam video, everybody's going to see it. It's going to be in the news. Everybody's going to watch it. And you're still usually in these cases, you're still in an ongoing investigation. When you put a video out there while you're still trying to gather witnesses and get testimony and so forth, I don't want the testimony from you that you're getting from this video you watched on CNN. I want to get your honest, sincere take of the moment when you were there across the street actually watching it. So there's a real danger there of it tainting witnesses. When you go to a DV call and you have two people involved in an altercation, you don't interview them together. You separate them so that you get two stories, not one melded story, because you're not going to get an accurate account of what happened if you let them interview them together. So there's the integrity of your witnesses. Okay. 2, if this goes to trial later, how are you possibly going to get an impartial jury when you've released a video out there that the whole public is seeing? So there's the integrity of the jury or the court procedure later on. That's problematic. In addition to that, what people don't understand, a lot of people don't understand about police use force, particularly shootings, is that investigation is often conducted by a third party. It's not conducted. If you're involved in a shooting as a police officer, your department is going to do an investigation, but then you're going to have an outside authority come out. In South Carolina, it's SLED. And their SLED shoot team is going to come down, and they don't know the officer from anybody. They're completely impartial. They're not affiliated with that department. They're not affiliated with the officer in any way. And they're going to come down and they're essentially leading the investigation. They're treating it as a homicide investigation. And it's actually their call a lot of times, or the third party call, whether or not that video can be released. It's not the actual agency that was involved. And so the agency may have no authority whatsoever to release it. They may be wanting to release it. And the third party that's actually conducting the investigation is like, nope, not going to happen. And so because they're worried that it's going to taint their investigation. So there are some very good procedural reasons. Having said that, I don't know if you guys kept up with this, but there was a shooting in Nashville, Tennessee about 2 weeks ago. In which an officer pulled over a woman and they wound up getting into a shootout with each other, and he was pretty seriously wounded by her, and he returned fire. She actually died, and it's a great example of two things. It's an example of exactly what I was talking about earlier. They got into an exchange of gunfire while she was in her car, and she drove away and then was found dead in her car a little ways down the road, just as we were talking about. But it was a situation which could have gotten very problematic. A lot of people were very upset about it. The initial reports was that she had possibly been unarmed, when in reality, she not only had a firearm, she fired at the officer first. And the Nashville Police Department made the executive decision to release that video preemptively to make sure that it didn't devolve into some sort of civil unrest or problem. And did that probably hurt the investigation or make the investigation a little more problematic? Possibly. But they made the decision in that moment that it was more important to inform the public to head off any issues. And to my knowledge, there weren't any problems, protests, or so forth, because it's very clear from the video that the officer was defending himself. And so, you know, we may be getting to a point in society where we are going to have to start weighing the cost benefit of releasing this video to satisfy the public and possibly head off problems versus possibly tainting your investigation or court procedures or something. Dr. Abercrombie?
Yeah, thanks, sir. And see, and then you start worrying about the politicizing of the police department when that occurs, because now what they're doing, just as Professor Lee said, they're weighing political concerns versus legal concerns.
Correct.
Also, you know, being a former, just for your information, I'm from law enforcement family. 3 generations back, I was a police officer for a while myself. Now, I've been involved in investigations where I thought I got some pretty good evidence, which is why you're trained to just follow the evidence and not have a closed mind. You continually look for evidence all the way through the court process, and sometimes after, if you're suspicious that there's more out there, because sometimes you can get evidence that would make a reasonable person believe this is what happened. And then 3 days later, you find other evidence that doesn't necessarily contradict it, but change the nature of the evidence that you found earlier, right? And lead you to a different conclusion. And what police also have to worry about is releasing evidence early in an investigation because of political reasons, and then finding out there's other evidence that makes what you release to the public, it changes its meaning. And
Right.
then you have to worry about a political blow up where you can be accused of trying to manipulate the public perception.
No, and I think furthermore, it's important to note that even a body cam or a dash cam, you're filming that incident from one angle and one viewpoint. And that doesn't always reveal everything that was known or everything that was observable at the time in the moment. And so we tend to think or make this assumption that, well, a video just tells you everything and tells you the truth. And that's probably true a lot of the time, but not necessarily all the time. You know, so again, there's no easy solution, unfortunately, to any of this. You're talking about incredibly dynamic, incredibly stressful situations that last typically a matter of seconds, which have ramifications that can last, you know, indefinitely. So it's a pretty tough place to be.
You know, I'll add.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Professor.
sure. I'll add one other perspective. If, for example, a lot of criminal defendants can bring a Section 1983 federal or civil rights action against law enforcement. And just like any statement can be used against a defendant, which is in the Miranda warning, if I'm an attorney bringing a civil rights suit against a police officer, I will be all over any early information that is released by law enforcement, and will intend to use it against the law enforcement in a civil suit, which again has that lower burden of proof, such as any conflicting statements. If I see where somebody says something, but some other information appears on a video, I think that's a serious hit to the credibility of law enforcement. It would be very helpful to a plaintiff's case against law enforcement.
And also, just for clarification, because I talk to these guys all the time, I've been working with them for over, 28 years now. we totally understand that if you've only got one bad police officer over 1,000, that is an unacceptable number, because we don't know, you don't know which one of those police officers are going to pull over your wife, your husband, your son, your daughter, your mother. So frequency versus seriousness, we understand, and it does happen. We end up with bad police officers. And it's a reasonable worry by the public, right, to be concerned about that, because we have all societies I've studied, France, Britain, Finland, Sweden, Panama, United States, Canada, have their share of corrupt and even worse, poorly trained police officers. So that is a real fear, and it's a reasonable one that's grounded in empirical evidence for long periods of time. What we're talking about now is a simple misunderstanding by the public, and then responding to that, which is an entirely different, I view as an entirely different situation. And then one more thing before I'm going to turn this over to Dwayne, because we've only got like 10 minutes left. Criminal justice versus social justice. I wanted to touch on this. People, when they call the police, often, if you look at the research, they have a situation that's out of their control, and they're judging it based upon the values and the norms, the beliefs of the culture, the society that they're from. And these values and norms, the reason they've adopted them and kept them after they've been taught them is because they work very well for them. The mistake they often make is fundamental. They're looking for social justice from the police, not criminal justice. And the police are seated as part of the criminal justice system. I was looking at a survey when I was teaching a police administration course, that people have a higher level of trust in the police than they do in the criminal justice system. And that doesn't make any sense, because they're seated in the system. They're part of that system. Worse, arguably, they are more manipulated by other institutions in the system. The laws that are passed by our legislators constrict what they can do. The interpretation of all those laws by the courts constrict what they can do. The police department they work for constrict what they can do. Law enforcement associations like the Association of Police Chiefs or the Fraternal Order of Police come up with best practices which guide the police as to what they're supposed to be doing. So their level of discretion is very, very narrow, and their expectations of what they're supposed to do that have been formalized by the criminal justice system and the political system dictate what their choices are. And the public have a tendency to misunderstand what the role of police are, and they have a tendency to judge police performance by their own values and beliefs, and they assume that the police share those values and beliefs. And what's very frustrating, which was very frustrating to me as a police officer, because often I did share those values and beliefs, but I was limited as to what I could do as a law enforcement officer when I arrived at that scene. We were talking about that earlier today. In South Carolina, for the longest time, if I responded to a domestic disturbance, and I couldn't figure out who instigated that disturbance, and it resulted in physical injury to one of the people there, guess what South Carolina law required me to do? Arrest both of them. Let the judge figure it out, right? To me, and to virtually every police officer I work with, that was really a destructive way of handling it, and gets into that zero tolerance thing. So that is a clarification that people need to understand on a more general social level, that there is a fundamental difference between criminal justice and social justice. And social justice is usually evolving faster. It's more progressive than criminal justice, since criminal justice usually reflects social justice. It's reactive, not proactive like social justice is. Professor Lee, do you have any We've got about 7 minutes left. Do you have any questions on chat?
I do. I have a follow-up to the previous question. It said, I think that what Dwayne's last mentioned is what law enforcement should do a better job communicating, the difficulties that the police are up against in doing their job. I think the public would be very empathetic if they had a better understanding of the challenges of the job. And I think that's absolutely true. I think the police have got to do a better job communicating with the public and educating them about fundamental truths like we were talking about before when it comes to use of force. And I'll say it again because I really do think it's fundamental. We're trained by instructors in the academy, and the public is trained by Hollywood. And Hollywood almost always gets everything wrong. They do things for dramatic effect. They do things for principles of storytelling. Reality is malleable. That's why it's called make-believe. And unfortunately, because the public is so inundated with police procedurals and things like that, it gives a false perception. And we come full circle back to the Thomas theorem. It gives a false perception, a false understanding of reality. As I always famously say to my students, I ask them, I tell them, I'm a geek. I've always been a geek. I have seen every episode of Star Trek at least 10 times. Does anyone in this room think that qualifies me to lead a space project for NASA? And everybody laughs. And then I say, why do you think you understand policing? Because you've seen every episode of Law and Order.
Which again gets us back to the whole communication to the public. I just feel like there's such a big disconnect there, and maybe that's an initiative that somebody somewhere could undertake, either on a local or state or bigger level. And just to add one other emphasis to Dr. Abercrombie's earlier point, when we get to the politics of it, look at what we have. We have a system where our sheriffs are elected. And if I'm a sheriff and I'm thinking, I better prosecute, I better make sure that guy goes. And then we have prosecutors who are elected, and they can't help as human beings but to have a little thought. And we have judges who are elected. And, unless you are a perfect person, it's hard not to let that influence you just a little when you're making your decision to arrest, to prosecute, and to sentence somebody.
And in defense of that, you really do want police, prosecutors, and judges aware of what's expected of them by the public, since they are public servants.
Sure.
But going full circle back to, again, that the Thomas theorem, like you both brought up, when those understandings are incorrect or destructive, that's when the issues start, right? And
yeah. And I guess my example would be, so if Dabo Sweeney up in Clemson gets stopped for a DUI, how popular would that be with the voters if you then prosecuted him to the fullest and had him convicted on those charges? And as opposed to if this case kind of just went away or never even made it, the officers at the scene just said, hey, we're going to give you a ride home because you're you, and not for any other reason. I mean, that's a reality.
it is. Professor Lee, do you have any other questions? While you're looking, I got some emails from students who knew this panel was going to happen, and they didn't know whether they were going to be able to attend it or not. So they emailed me some questions. They were trying to figure out what the character of police were, their level of education, their income, and stuff like that. So let me just respond to that, so it'll be in the recording so they can hear it. The average income for police in the United States in 2019 was $48,418 a year. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the number of police in the United States just last year dropped 11%. So it's becoming an unpopular career. A public perception is that the police are not that well educated. That goes to a stereotype, again, that you see in movies and stuff. The FBI, in cooperation with Higher Ed, did a study, and frighteningly, less than 1% of police departments require a 4-year degree, but in their surveys, 88% of the law enforcement officers had a 2-year degree or higher. Over 50% had a 4-year degree. So we're dealing with college educated people who have options other than law enforcement. And they usually have a tendency to pick law enforcement because they have friends or family that are in it, or they have perceptions, correctly or not, that they can make a difference in their communities, in their state, and in their society. And that leads to a very high dropout rate in police. I haven't been able to find numbers in the last decade for that, which makes me raise an eyebrow, because I know they're doing those studies, they're just not publishing them, right? But last time I looked, it was like a 20% dropout rate in law enforcement the first year. Professor Lee, Professor McSorley, do y'all have any, does that sound about right to you? Or is it higher or
No,
lower?
we're having a real problem with turnover here in South Carolina, real problem. And it's like you said, people are not sticking with the profession like they used to. And part of it is because of, the things that are going on in society. Part of it is the pay, of course. They're not paid very well. We did get one quick question. How's the code of blue impacted the perception of the police when you see both the movie version and in real life how it works and appears to punish those officers who may go against the brotherhood? I'll say this, when you actually, and the National Institute of Justice has done this, when you actually look at the arrest rates among the police versus the general population, it's about the same. And so the notion that police officers are reluctant to arrest or charge or prosecute other police officers, that's actually not true. Cops arrest a lot of cops all the time, and they are not shy about prosecuting. Every department has what used to be called internal affairs. Now in the modern world, it's called OPSI, which is Office of Professional Standards and Inspection. And that is literally a division which does nothing but investigate the rest of the police force. And I know that's often perceived as on TV as sweeping things under the cup, but they bring a lot of charges against a lot of officers. And if you just keep an eye on the news, we have chiefs of police in this state who have been arrested by their own officers for domestic abuse. I mean, think about that. You're the chief of police and an officer is going to come, and if it's a DV and it meets the standards of DV, you're going to jail. That's, just like anybody else. So, I can't say that never happens, but again, when you look at arrest rates, they're not any less. So, perhaps that says something, but unfortunately, I think, I think we're out of time. And maybe that needs to be communicated. You're right. Maybe that's something too that needs to be communicated better to the public.
Yeah, I'm afraid we are right at 11 o'clock, and I know our panelists have classes to teach and other panels to go to. So thank you very much for coming to this.
Great.
We are going to be posting a recording of this at the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences website. And here's the address. I know, but you can get to it through MyMTC. Also, many of you are going to get an email with if you've attended this thing, with a recording so you can review it. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the experience and it was productive for you. Again, Professor Lee, Professor McSorley, thank you very much. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
My pleasure.